The final resting place of ancient Egyptian Queen Nefertiti could finally have been discovered thanks to advances in modern technology.
For thousands of years, Egypt seemed to tell its own story. The monuments were there, the hieroglyphs were there, the tombs, the gods, the dynasties, all of it carved in stone, preserved in desert air, cataloged and taught to generations of school children across the world. Egypt was ancient. Egypt was African. Egypt was the Nile, and the Nile was its lifeblood, and everything made sense. Then the DNA arrived, and something in that tidy story, something that had been quietly uncomfortable for decades, finally cracked open. It was not the kind of revelation that arrives with fanfare. It came in the form of micrograms of degraded biological material extracted from mummies in a carefully controlled laboratory. It came from analyses run and rerun to rule out contamination. It came slowly, painstakingly, the way real scientific breakthroughs often do, not with a shout, fanfare, but with a number that didn't add up. What that number implied about the origins of one of humanity's greatest civilizations was not what anyone had expected. And depending on how you read it, it either complicated the old story enormously or revealed that the old story had always been missing something. This is not a simple origin story. It never was. For most of recorded history, the narrative of ancient Egypt seemed remarkably coherent. Manzuri. Here was a civilization that emerged in the Nile Valley roughly 5,000 years ago, building on foundations laid by even earlier populations who had migrated from sub-Saharan Africa and the surrounding Saharan region. Mensley. The ancient Egyptians were understood to be African native to the continent, shaped by the same vast network of cultures and peoples that had been developing along the Nile for millennia before the first pharaoh ever raised a staff. Archaeologists pointed to material continuity. Early pre-dynastic settlements showed gradual cultural evolution, not sudden replacement. Anthropologists noted skeletal morphology consistent with populations from the broader northeastern African corridor. Linguists traced the ancient Egyptian language to the Afro-Asiatic family. Elster, a language group rooted in Africa, shared with Semitic languages, Berber languages, Cushitic languages spoken across the Horn of Africa. Everything fit, or at least everything was made to fit. The deeper question, who the ancient Egyptians were at the level of biology, at the level of ancestry, was largely considered settled. They were an African population shaped by Africa, living in Africa, creating one of Africa's greatest legacies for many scholars and communities. And that framing carried enormous historical and political weight, and the evidence as it stood seemed to support it. But even before the genetics entered the room, there were things that didn't quite line up. The first friction was quiet. It was there in the theology, in the archaeology, if you were willing to look at it without the comfort of a predetermined conclusion. The pre-dynastic period, the centuries and millennia before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 30,100 BCE, showed something strange in the material record of the Eastern Nile Delta. There were pottery styles, burial practices, architectural elements, and agricultural patterns that bore a striking resemblance to those emerging simultaneously in the ancient Near East, in the Levant, in parts of what is now Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. This was not necessarily surprising. The ancient world was not a sealed container. Trade happened, ideas moved, people moved. A ceramic vessel from one region appearing in another does not prove migration. Cultural exchange is not genetic exchange. But the similarities were numerous, and they concentrated, strangely, in the very period when Egyptian civilization was accelerating, when complexity, grandeur, hierarchy, and monumental architecture were first emerging in the Nile Valley. Some scholars filed this under influence, others under coincidence. Sure. Others argued it reflected the movement of elites, a small number of people carrying ideas, not a mass migration of populations, for a long time. That explanation held. It was elegant, it preserved the continuity narrative. Then came the genomics. The technology that changed this conversation was not available for most of Egyptology's history. For generations, researchers could only study ancient Egyptians through what they left behind: their art, their tools, their written language, their mummified remains. The biological information locked inside those remains, the genome was considered unreadable. Mummies were too degraded. Egypt's heat destroyed DNA faster than almost any other environment on Earth. Ancient DNA recovery depends heavily on cold, dry conditions. Think Siberian permafrost, Scandinavian bogs, alpine ice. Egypt, despite its dryness, is warm enough for long enough that researchers believed meaningful genomic data from ancient Egyptians would be nearly impossible to extract. That assumption held until it didn't. In 2017, a team of researchers published what many considered the first reliable ancient genomic analysis of ancient Egyptians. The study focused on mummies recovered from Abu Sir el Malek, an archaeological site south of Cairo, spanning a period from roughly 1400 BCE to 400 CE, covering the New Kingdom, the late period, and into the Greco-Roman era. Using teeth and bone petrous, one of the densest bones in the human skull, which tends to preserve DNA better than softer tissue, the team successfully extracted and sequenced whole genome data from a subset of the mummies. The results were published in Nature Communications, and they immediately sparked one of the most intense debates Egyptology had seen in decades. If you want more stories where the evidence rewrites the map, subscribe, because what came next was something almost no one predicted. The researchers found that the ancient Egyptians they sampled, and it is important to note that this is a limited sample drawn from one site. One region, one span of time, showed a genetic profile that was surprisingly and significantly oriented toward the ancient Near East, not modern Middle Easterners. Later, not contemporary populations from the Levant. Ancient populations. The genetic affinities pointed most strongly toward ancient peoples from the Fertile Crescent, the Levant, and to a lesser degree, Southeastern Europe and Anatolia. Sub-Saharan African ancestry, the kind of ancestry that characterizes populations from West. Central, East, and Southern Africa was present in the ancient Egyptian samples, but it was lower than many had assumed, lower than what researchers found in modern Egyptians. When the team compared the ancient samples to present-day Egyptians, they found that modern Egyptians show significantly more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient mummies they analyzed. The researchers suggested this could reflect increased sub-Saharan gene flow into Egypt during later periods, the medieval centuries, the trans-Saharan trade networks. The long history of the African interior interacting with the Nile corridor, that was not a contradiction, it was a signal. The story was not collapsing, it was widening. What followed that 2017 study was a wave of competing interpretations, and it is important to sit with all of them rather than jumping to the first available conclusion. And the first framework. Ancient Egypt was built in significant part by populations with deep Near Eastern ancestry, and this ancestry arrived long before the dynasties began. Else, some researchers argue that the Neolithic expansion, the wave of early farmers who moved out of the Fertile Crescent during the agricultural revolution, beginning around 10,000 BCE, spread west through the Levant and southwest into the Nile Delta. This movement would have carried both agricultural knowledge and ancestral genetic profiles into northeastern Africa. By the time Egyptian civilization was crystallizing, the population of the Nile Valley may already have been a mixture of this Neolithic Near Eastern ancestry and older North African and Northeastern African hunter-gatherer lineages. The second framework. The Near Eastern signal is real, but its interpretation requires caution. Ancient DNA research in Egypt is still in its infancy. As the 2017 study sampled a small number of individuals from a single site, Abusir el Malek in Middle Egypt, which may not represent the genetic diversity of the entire Nile Valley across all periods. Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, the Delta Nubia, these were not identical populations. The genetic history of the ancient Egyptian state likely varied by region, by era, by social class. More data is needed before any overarching claim can be made with confidence. The third framework, perhaps the most unsettling for the old narrative, is that the ancient Egyptians were always a mosaic, that the civilization that produced the pyramids, the Book of the Dead, the earliest known state bureaucracy, was never ethnically or genetically monolithic, that it was, from the beginning, a meeting point between Africa, the Near East, the Mediterranean, and that its genius may have been precisely that convergence. Each of these frameworks carries weight. None of them is yet fully proven, and that ambiguity is where the most honest science currently lives. Beyond the 2017 study, the picture has only grown more complex. Research into modern Egyptian genetics has traced deep layers of ancestry that predate the dynastic period, entirely signals pointing back to Paleolithic North African populations. To lineages that were present along the Nile before agriculture, before cities, before writing. These ancient layers coexist with the Neolithic Near Eastern signals, with later admixture from sub-Saharan populations, with Greek, Roman, Arab, and other contributions layered on top across the millennia. When researchers map the Y chromosome lineages of modern Egyptians, they find haplogroups common in the Middle East alongside African haplogroups, alongside rarer signals that speak to migrations so old they predate any known civilization. The maternal lines, the mitochondrial DNA, tell a somewhat different story. Later, with a stronger African component in some analyses, the two lines of inheritance are not always saying the same thing, which in itself is informative. It suggests the mixing happened in specific directions, specific social contexts, specific historical moments. The genome of an ancient Egyptian mummy is not a political statement. It is a record, an archive of every population that contributed to a person's existence, sometimes reaching back hundreds of generations across distances that would have seemed impossible on foot. And what that archive shows is increasingly is that ancient Egypt was not the end product of a single ancestral stream. It was a confluence, a living intersection. Stand at the edge of the Nile at dusk, somewhere between Luxor and Aswan, and try to imagine who stood there 5,000 years ago. The river does not care about the question that it has been moving north since before the first temple was raised, before the first dynasty, before the first farmer planted grain in the black silt of its banks. The desert on either side is absolute still. The sky is the color of copper before it fades into black, and somewhere in that landscape, People were building something that had never been built before, organizing labor at a scale the world had not yet seen, developing a written language to track grain and gods and the passage of years. And who were they genetically? The honest answer, even now, is more complicated than we thought. They were African, they carried Near Eastern ancestry. However, some may have carried ancestry stretching back to populations that no longer exist as distinct groups, ghost populations in the genomicist's language, that absorbed and blended across millennia of prehistoric contact. They were, in all likelihood, not what any single modern political or racial framework would claim them to be. That is not a loss. That is the actual story. What this research ultimately reveals is something larger than any single civilization's origin story. Elder, ancient Egypt forces the question that modern genomics keeps answering in the same way across every population it studies. Human beings do not move in neat streams. They do not stay in place and develop in isolation until the map finally sorts them into legible categories. They move, they meet, they merge, emerge. They separate and remerge. They carry the genomes of people they never knew across distances that would have taken their ancestors decades to travel. Elsher. The ancient Egyptians were not a sealed population that sprang fully formed from the Nile mud. They were a layered people, as all people are shaped by tens of thousands of years of movement across Africa, the Near East, the Mediterranean basin. The civilization they built was extraordinary, not because it came from one pure source, but because it drew from the convergence of many. The DNA does not diminish that. If anything, it deepens it. The study of ancient Egyptian genetics is still in early stages. Researchers are explicit about this. The samples are limited. Elder preservation across different sites varies enormously. The complexity of ancient Egyptian society spanning 3,000 years, dozens of dynasties, enormous geographic range, cannot be captured by any single data set, however carefully collected. What we have today is a beginning, a first serious look into the genome of one of history's most studied and least biologically understood civilizations. And what that beginning suggests is not that the old story was entirely wrong. It is that the old story was too small, too clean, too comfortable with its own tidiness. The ancient Egyptians built structures that have outlasted every empire that came after them. They developed a written language capable of recording both tax receipts and theological philosophy. They mapped the stars and built calendars and preserved the dead with a precision that still stuns modern chemists. And they did all of this as what they always were. A people shaped by the full, complicated weight of human history, not a symbol, not a possession, not a proof of anyone's contemporary argument. The genome, in the end, is not trying to claim them for one side or another. It is trying to remember them as they actually were, and that is the story that was always hiding inside the stone. And if this kind of deep, science-driven history matters to you, subscribe. There are far more stories like this buried in the human past, waiting for the evidence to surface.